The table at left shows fuel consumption by cars for various years. Then they give us the model C equals 0.87 T or 87 hundredths T plus 64 and 27 hundredths can be used to describe the annual fuel consumption in billions of gallons, which we're calling C, where T is the number of years since 1990. So let's just go in before we get too much further and just kind of mark up and see what we have going on here. So we're given this model, this equation, that somebody has taken the information from this table and has come up with this model for us. And they're using that to describe the annual fuel consumption in billions of gallons C. So the fuel consumption in billions of gallons is being given by the variable C. And then we have to say, well, what's then T? T, they tell us, is the number of years since 1990. Okay. So that's a lot of information that they've packed in there. So let's see what they want us to do with that information. Use the model to estimate the year when the annual fuel consumption of cars will be greater than 80 billion gallons. So they want to know when the fuel consumption of cars. So what information tells us the fuel consumption of cars? Oh, remember up here, that was the C. So the fuel consumption, C, will be greater than 80 billion gallons. Now this greater than means when we go to translate this information into um, something that we're going to be working with, we need to be thinking about an inequality rather than an equation because it doesn't say when will the fuel consumption be 80 gallons, but for what years will the fuel consumption be greater than 80 billion gallons. So let's take a look how we can set this up. The equation that we're given is C equals 0.87 T plus 64.27. So that's the equation we were given. But now what we want to do is we want to figure out when this consumption is going to be greater than 80 billion gallons. Now, how do we figure out the fuel consumption? We use this, this little expression here, right? So we want to know when the 0.87 T plus 64.27, we want to know when is that going to be greater than 80 billion gallons. And remember, because this equation gives us the information in billions of gallons, we don't need to write all the zeros at the end of that. We can just write that as the 80. So here's the inequality that we're going to be set forth to try to solve here. So let's see if we can solve out this inequality. First thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to get the 64.27 to the right side of the inequality. So let's subtract that from both sides. 64.27, again 64.27. And this would be the sort of problem where using a calculator, that would be a totally appropriate tool to use on a problem like this. And so I'm just going to go ahead and come up with the values rather than showing everything longhand because I'm using my calculator to come up with our values here. So 0.87t, remember that's greater than, here the 64.27 canceled out. Over here, whoops, I better put my subtraction sign there. I don't want to forget that I'm subtracting. When we subtract that, we are going to end up with 15.73. Remember, our goal is to get t by itself. So now we need to clear out that 0.87 that's holding on by multiplying. So we're going to divide both sides by 0.87. Always use the opposite operation to clear it over to the other side, 0.87. And then when we go ahead, let me get that 7 written down there. When we do our dividing here, we're going to find that this doesn't come out nice and tidy, but since all of my other values were to 2 decimal places, I'm going to round my answer to 2 decimal places as well. We're finding that t is greater than 18.08. So that's rounded to the hundredths place. Now we have to figure out what this means. Well, remember what we saw up above. We saw that T is the number of years since 1990. That was the information up here. And so if we think about, well, this is just a little bit more than 18 years since 1990. So what year would that be? Well, 1990 plus another 18 years down the road would equal 2008, right? Now, what does this mean? That means during the year 2008, and presumably for all years after 2008, fuel consumption for cars would be over 80 billion gallons. Okay. So we would want to say that we want to go ahead and just sort of state our final answer clearly. So I'm going to go ahead and type that up because I think it'll be a little bit easier for me to type it than to try to write it. So after 2008, annual fuel consumption, and remember this is just for cars, it's not for trucks and that kind of things. So annual fuel consumption for cars will be greater than 80 billion gallons. So that's a good statement. It clearly goes back to the problem, and we're sure that we've answered the question that was being asked.